Number 10. Takabuti. The museum mummy who was murdered in 1835, a richly decorated Egyptian coffin was opened in Belfast, and inside was the body of a young woman who had died more than 2,500 years earlier. Her name was Takabuti. Unlike many ancient dead who remain anonymous, she still had a name, a coffin, a title, and a place in the imagination of the modern world. She became one of the most famous Egyptian mummies in Ireland, displayed, studied, admired, and remembered as a beautiful survivor from the age of the pharaohs. But for generations, nobody knew she was a murder victim. Takabuti lived in ancient Thebes during Egypt's 25th dynasty, around the 7th century BCE. Her coffin described her as a mistress of a great house, suggesting a woman of status. She was not a nameless laborer buried in the desert. She belonged to an elite world of temples, households, scribes, rituals, and burial customs designed to carry identity into the afterlife. Her body was carefully mummified. Her hair, skin, and features were preserved well enough that people in the modern age felt they could almost meet her face to face. For a long time, that preservation was the story. Takabuti was treated as a remarkable mummy, a window into ancient Egyptian funerary practice, a body carried across time by linen, resin, and museum care. But modern forensics changed what could be asked of her. Scientists no longer had to unwrap a mummy or damage it to investigate. They could look inside with imaging, genetics, pathology, and chemical analysis. The body could become a case file. When researchers re-examined Takabuti, the mystery sharpened. Modern scans revealed a wound in her upper back, near the left shoulder. It was not damage from excavation. It was not a crack from time. It was a penetrating injury. The weapon had entered from behind, passing into the body in a way consistent with a violent attack. Takabuti had not simply died young, she had been stabbed. That discovery transformed her completely. For nearly 2 centuries, visitors had looked at her as an ancient Egyptian mummy. They had seen a preserved woman, a coffin, a museum object, but beneath the surface was a crime scene. The wound had been there the entire time, hidden inside the body, waiting for the technology capable of seeing it. The killer had disappeared into history. The wound had not. The direction of the injury made the case even darker. A wound from behind suggests surprise, ambush, or attack from someone Takabuti did not face in time. There were no witnesses we can question, no papyrus trial record, no named suspect. We do not know whether the violence happened inside a household, in a street, during conflict, or in some private moment that ended suddenly. But the body records what history did not. A blade entered her back, and her life ended violently. Forensic study also gave back pieces of her biography. Takabuti was a young adult woman. Her ancestry, physical traits, hair, dental condition, and mummification all became data points in a life reconstructed from remains. Even her heart, long assumed absent or misplaced in earlier examinations, became part of the renewed investigation. Modern science did not only ask how she died, it asked who she had been. That is what makes Takabuti such a powerful cold case. She was never truly lost. She was visible the entire time. She was on display, named, catalogued, photographed, and studied. Yet the most important fact about her death remained hidden for almost 200 years. The museum had preserved her body, but only forensic technology could read the violence inside it. And there is something unsettling about that delay. How many ancient bodies have been placed under glass, while their final moments remain unseen? How many mummies were labeled as examples of burial practice when they were also evidence of murder, disease, assault, or trauma? Archaeology once depended on what the eye could see. Modern forensics makes the dead visible in new layers, beneath skin, beneath linen, beneath bone, beneath centuries of assumption. Takabuti belongs among the ancient cold cases modern forensics finally solved because her story proves that preservation is not the same as understanding. A body can sit in a museum for generations and still keep its secret. A name can survive while the truth of a death remains buried. A wound can wait longer than the memory of the person who made it. The ancient Egyptians tried to give Takabuti eternity through mummification. They preserved her face, her name, and her journey into the afterlife. But they could not preserve the explanation for the blade that killed her. That explanation is gone. What remains is the wound finally seen by modern science, cutting through the silence after more than 2,500 years. Takabuti was not only a mummy, she was a woman murdered from behind, and for the first time in centuries, the dead had evidence strong enough to speak. Number 9. Ötzi the Iceman, the 5300-year-old murder in the Alps in 1991. Two hikers crossing the Tassel Alps near the border of Austria and Italy saw a body emerging from the melting ice. At first, they thought it was a modern mountaineer who had died in an accident. The head, shoulders, and back were exposed. The skin was dark, the body twisted, the gear scattered nearby. Rescue workers treated the remains like a recent corpse, pulling and cutting at the ice before anyone understood what had actually been found. The man was not modern. He had been frozen for more than 5,000 years. He became known as Ötzi the Iceman, one of the most famous ancient bodies ever discovered. His clothing, tools, weapons, food, tattoos, and preserved tissue opened a window into Copper Age Europe with almost impossible detail. He carried a copper axe, a flint dagger, a bow, arrows, a grass cloak, animal, hide clothing, and supplies for travel through the mountains. He was not a museum skeleton. He was a person caught almost whole in the moment between life and archaeology. For years, the question was simple. How did he die? At first, exposure seemed plausible. He was high in the mountains. He may have been caught in bad weather, injured, exhausted, or trapped by cold. The ice had preserved him so perfectly that it was easy to imagine a lonely accident. One man, one mountain pass, one fatal storm. But modern forensics slowly turned the accident into a crime scene. The breakthrough came when imaging revealed something hidden inside his left shoulder, a stone arrowhead. It had entered from behind and lodged deep in the body. The wound had damaged a major artery near the shoulder, an injury that could have caused rapid blood loss. Ötzi had not simply lain down and frozen. Someone had shot him. That discovery changed everything. A body once explained as a natural death became a murder victim. The mountain was no longer only a place of exposure. It was the scene of an attack. The arrowhead had remained inside him for more than 50 centuries, waiting for X-rays and CT scans to see what the ice had concealed. Other forensic clues made the final hours even darker. Ötzi had injuries on his hand that may have come from close combat shortly before death. Blood traces from other people were reportedly associated with some of his gear, suggesting conflict, pursuit, or violence involving more than one individual. His stomach contents showed that he had eaten shortly before he died, including a rich final meal. This was not a man starving for days in the mountains. He still had food inside him when the arrow struck. The position of the arrow wound suggests he may not have seen the fatal shot coming. It entered from behind or from an angle that placed the attacker out of his direct view. Afterward, Ötzi may have collapsed, bled heavily, and died in the high alpine landscape. Snow and ice then did what burial never could. They sealed him, preserved him, and kept the evidence intact for thousands of years. What makes Ötzi so powerful as a cold case is the level of detail. His body preserved tattoos, worn joints, parasites, dental disease, genetic information, clothing technology, and even clues to his diet and movements. Scientists could reconstruct not only his death, but pieces of his life, where he had traveled, what he had eaten, what tools he carried, what illnesses he endured, and what kind of world he moved through. The forensic file became almost impossibly personal, but the motive remains beyond reach. Was he ambushed by enemies? Was he fleeing after a fight? Was he killed over property, revenge, territory, status, or some conflict we cannot name? His copper axe was still with him, an object valuable enough that simple robbery does not fully explain the scene. Whoever killed him either did not find the axe, did not have time to take it, or did not kill him for that reason. The wound was solved. The reason was not. That is why Ötzi the Iceman belongs among the ancient cold cases modern forensics finally solved. He proves that a body can be both ancient and investigable, both archaeological treasure and murder victim. The ice did not just preserve his face and tools, it preserved the crime, the arrowhead, the wound path, the final meal, the injuries, and the evidence that his death was not an accident of the mountains. For more than 5,000 years, Ötzi lay in the ice with the weapons still inside him. The killer disappeared. The community disappeared. The language disappeared. But the evidence remained. Frozen in a body the modern world almost mistook for a lost hiker. When science finally looked beneath the skin, the Alps gave up their secret. The Iceman had not simply died. He had been murdered. Number 8. King Tutankhamun. The boy king whose murder theory collapsed for nearly a century. The death of Tutankhamun was one of archaeology's most famous mysteries. He was the boy king of Egypt, buried in a tomb filled with gold, and made immortal by a death that seemed far too young. He came to the throne as a child. He died around the age of 19, and because his tomb was so spectacular, the question of his death became impossible to leave alone. Theories grew around him like shadows. Some imagined assassination, some blamed a blow to the head, others suggested a chariot crash, poison, infection, or a political plot by men who wanted the throne. His short reign came after the religious chaos of Akhenaten, when Egypt was trying to recover from one of the strangest periods in its history. A young king, powerful advisors, a sudden death. It was perfect material for a royal murder mystery. For decades, one detail fueled that theory more than any other. Earlier X-rays seemed to show a suspicious mark near the base of his skull. To some, it looked like evidence that Tutankhamun had been struck from behind. The image was simple and dramatic. The boy king murdered in a palace conspiracy, then buried quickly beneath gold. But modern forensics did what speculation could not. CT scanning allowed researchers to examine the mummy in thin internal slices, separating damage caused during life from damage caused by embalming, excavation, or handling after death. The skull theory began to collapse. The suspicious material was not clear evidence of a fatal blow. Much of the damage could be explained by mummification, tomb conditions, and modern removal from the coffin. Then DNA and medical analysis changed the case even further. Tutankhamun was not a healthy young ruler who died suddenly under suspicious circumstances. His body showed signs of a fragile life shaped by royal inbreeding and disease. Genetic study linked him to the 18th dynasty royal family and supported the conclusion that his parents were closely related, likely siblings. That kind of family breeding could concentrate genetic problems, and Tutankhamun's body appears to have carried the consequences. He had a clubfoot and other foot problems that would have made walking difficult. This explains one of the strangest details in his tomb, the large number of walking sticks buried with him. They were not only symbols of royal authority, many were worn from use. The Golden Boy King may have needed them to move through life. Behind the mask was a young man living with pain and physical limitation. The scans also revealed a serious fracture in his left thigh bone near the knee. The injury appears to have happened around the time of death. If the fracture became infected, it could have been dangerous, especially in an age without antibiotics. A broken leg for a young pharaoh was not simple. It could become a doorway to fever, sepsis, and death. And then came another clue. Malaria. Genetic testing detected evidence of Plasmodium falciparum, the parasite responsible for the most severe form of malaria. This meant Tutankhamun may have been fighting a dangerous infection, while already weakened by congenital problems and trauma. His death began to look less like one dramatic murder, and more like a convergence of vulnerabilities, bad genetics, disability, injury, infection, and disease striking a body that had little reserve left. That is what makes the forensic solution so powerful. It did not give the answer people expected. It took away the clean murder story and replaced it with something more human. Tutankhamun was not necessarily a victim of a palace assassin. He may have been a fragile teenager born into the biological cost of dynastic purity, ruling a kingdom while his own body was failing him. The gold had misled the world. His burial made him look invincible. Mask, throne, chariots, weapons, jewelry, shrines, and ritual protection stacked around him in breathtaking layers. But CT scans and DNA looked past the treasure. They found the young body beneath the legend, damaged, diseased, genetically burdened, and vulnerable. That is why King Tutankhamun belongs among the ancient cold cases modern forensics finally solved. Modern science did not uncover a murderer standing in the shadows. It uncovered something colder, a royal bloodline turning inward on itself, a boy king who walked with difficulty, a broken bone near death, and malaria moving through his blood. For almost 100 years people searched Tutankhamun's death for conspiracy. The forensic evidence gave them tragedy instead. The boy king was not murdered by history's favorite villain. He was undone by the body he inherited, the diseases he carried, and an injury that may have arrived at exactly the wrong time. Cold Case did not end with a confession. It ended with a scan, a genome, and the realization that the Golden Pharaoh was far more fragile than his mask. Number 7. Hatshepsut. The lost pharaoh identified by one tooth for more than 3,000 years. One of Egypt's most powerful rulers was almost erased from history. Hatshepsut was not a queen in the background of someone else's reign. She was pharaoh. She ruled Egypt during the 18th dynasty, built monuments, sent trade expeditions, raised obelisks, and presented herself with the full symbols of kingship. But after her death, her memory was attacked. Her names were chiseled away, her images were defaced, her place in the royal line was blurred, then her body vanished. Hatshepsut had prepared a royal tomb, but when archaeologists later searched for her mummy, there was no obvious queen waiting in a named coffin. Instead, there were fragments, displaced objects, unidentified female bodies, and a historical silence created by ancient politics and modern uncertainty. For generations, scholars knew Hatshepsut had existed, but the physical body of the female pharaoh remained one of Egypt's great missing persons cases. The key to solving it did not come from a grand inscription or a golden mask. It came from something far smaller, a tooth. In the early 1900s, Howard Carter discovered tomb KV60 in the Valley of the Kings. Inside were two female mummies. One was in a coffin associated with Hatshepsut's nurse. The other lay on the floor, uncoffined, heavy-bodied, one arm bent across the chest. At the time, she did not look like the missing pharaoh. She looked like an anonymous displaced mummy, the kind of body that could sit in archaeological uncertainty for another century. And that is exactly what happened. Then modern forensic investigation returned to the case. Researchers examined several candidate mummies and compared them with a small canopic box bearing Hatshepsut's name. Inside that box was a preserved molar tooth. CT scanning allowed scientists to study the tooth's shape, roots, and dimensions without destroying it. Then they compared it with the jaws of the unidentified mummies. The match pointed to the floor mummy from KV60. In that mummy's upper jaw was a missing molar socket. The tooth from Hatshepsut's canopic box fit the gap closely enough to transform an unidentified body into one of the most important identifications in Egyptian archaeology. A woman ignored for decades, lying without royal display, was suddenly no longer anonymous. She was Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh, whose memory had survived in stone, but whose body had been misplaced by history. That is what makes the case so powerful. Hatshepsut was not identified through the kind of spectacle people expect from ancient Egypt. No intact tomb, no shining coffin, no dramatic inscription resting on her chest. Her identity came through forensic dentistry. One tooth, one jaw, one missing space, and modern imaging precise enough to connect them after 3,500 years. The scans also revealed the human being beneath the royal title. Hatshepsut was probably around 50 when she died. Her body showed signs of obesity, dental disease, and serious health problems. Some analyses suggested cancer or other chronic illness may have weakened her. The powerful pharaoh who built temples and commanded Egypt was also a person living inside a vulnerable body, affected by age, infection, pain, and disease. That contrast is what modern forensics does best. Ancient monuments show power, bodies show cost. Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari presents her as divine, chosen, eternal, and legitimate. Her mummy tells another truth. The ruler was mortal, her teeth failed, her body suffered, and whatever politics tried to erase her, biology preserved enough evidence to bring her back. There is also a darker irony in the way she was found. A pharaoh who ruled as king, who had monuments carved with her name, who tried to secure eternity in the Egyptian way, ended up lying for decades as an unidentified mummy on a tomb floor. Tourists and archaeologists passed near her without knowing who she was. History had not destroyed her completely. It had hidden her in plain sight. That is why Hatshepsut belongs among the ancient cold cases modern forensics finally solved. Her case was not a murder investigation in the usual sense. It was an identity case, a royal disappearance solved by medical imaging and dental matching. The question was not who killed her, but where she had gone. And after millennia of erasure, one molar answered, Hatshepsut's enemies tried to remove her from memory. Time misplaced her body. Archaeology overlooked her. But modern forensics found the clue small enough to survive all of that. A single tooth restored a lost pharaoh to history, proving that sometimes the dead do not need a voice, a tomb inscription, or a confession. Sometimes they only need one piece of the body to fit where it always belonged. Number 6. Ramesses III. The pharaoh whose throat was cut for more than 3,000 years. The death of Ramesses III sat between history and rumor. He was one of the last great pharaohs of Egypt's new kingdom, a ruler who defended Egypt against invasion, built temples, and tried to hold together a kingdom already beginning to weaken. But near the end of his reign, the palace itself turned against him. Ancient documents described a conspiracy inside the royal household, involving one of his wives, her son, and a network of officials, servants, and insiders close enough to reach the king. The plot became known as the Harem Conspiracy. The papyri that recorded the trial survived, but they left one crucial question open. Did the conspirators actually kill Ramesses III, or were they stopped before the assassination succeeded? The documents described arrests, interrogations, punishments, and names of people involved. They suggested a violent attempt against the pharaoh, but ancient legal language could be careful, symbolic, or politically shaped. For generations, Egyptologists debated whether the king had truly died by murder. His mummy did not seem to answer. Ramesses III had been found in the royal mummy cache at Deir el-Bahari, preserved and wrapped like a king. To the naked eye, there was no obvious fatal wound. The embalmers had hidden him well. His face survived, his body survived, but the evidence of death, if it existed, was sealed beneath linen, resin, and layers of ritual protection. Then modern imaging reopened the case. CT scanning allowed researchers to look inside the mummy without cutting it apart. Slice by slice, the machine passed through the wrappings, skin, bone, and embalming material. What it revealed was not ambiguous. Beneath the bandages, across the throat of Ramesses III, was a deep horizontal wound. The cut was wide and severe, passing through vital structures in the neck. It would have been rapidly fatal. The pharaoh had not died peacefully. His throat had been cut. That discovery transformed the harem conspiracy from a court drama into a solved assassination. The papyri had not exaggerated. The attack had reached the king. The conspirators had succeeded in killing him, even if they failed to place their chosen prince securely on the throne. For 3,000 years, the truth had been hidden, not because the wound was absent, but because embalming concealed it. The embalmers had placed an amulet over the wound, likely as a magical protection for the afterlife. That detail is haunting. They knew the throat was destroyed. They knew the king entered eternity with a violent injury. In Egyptian belief, the body needed to be whole, protected, and restored for the next world. The amulet was not only decoration, it was an attempt to heal what murder had opened. The forensic story became even darker when another mummy was studied alongside him. A body known as Unknown Man had long puzzled researchers. He was wrapped strangely, with an expression that looked almost agonized, and his burial lacked the normal dignity of royal mummification. DNA analysis showed he was closely related to Ramesses III. Many researchers now identify him as Prince Pentower, the son connected to the conspiracy, likely punished after the plot was exposed. If that identification is correct, the cold case becomes a complete palace tragedy. Queen and her allies planned to remove the king. A prince stood to benefit. The pharaoh was killed. The conspirators were tried. The prince died in disgrace. And thousands of years later, Connecticut scans and DNA reunited the victim and suspected conspirator inside the same forensic story. That is what makes Ramesses III one of the most powerful ancient cold cases modern forensics finally solved. The written record gave suspicion. The mummy gave proof. Without CT imaging, the case might still be debated as a historical possibility. With it, the wound became visible, the papyri became clearer, and one of the oldest political assassinations in history could finally be confirmed. Ramesses III had ruled as a god-king, surrounded by ritual, guards, family, servants, and the machinery of royal power. Yet the fatal danger came from inside that world, not from a foreign army. Not from a battlefield, not from a rebellion at the borders, from the palace, from the household, from people close enough to turn royal privacy into a murder scene. For centuries the bandages kept the secret. The papyri whispered around it. The king's throat remained hidden beneath the work of embalmers, who tried to restore him for eternity. Then a hospital machine built for living patients looked into a dead pharaoh and found the cut. Ramesses III was not only the subject of an ancient conspiracy, he was its victim. And after more than 3 millennia, modern forensics finally let the wound testify. Number 5. Old Croghan Man and Clonycavan Man. Ireland's bog body princes in 2003. 2 bodies came out of Irish peat within the same year, and both looked less like ordinary burials than messages left in violence. One was found near Clonycavan in County Meath, the other surfaced near Croghan Hill in County Offaly. The bog had darkened their skin, preserved details ordinary soil would have destroyed, and held them for more than 2,000 years, until modern archaeology treated them not as curiosities, but as crime scenes. They became known as Clonycavan Man and Old Croghan Man. At first they seemed like separate discoveries. 2 Iron Age men, preserved in different bogs, damaged by peat cutting, time, and ancient violence. But forensic analysis began to connect them. Their dates were close, their treatment was similar, their injuries were extreme, and the more researchers studied them, the more the 2 bodies began to look like parts of the same ritual pattern. Old Croghan Man was physically striking. Though only parts of his body survived, estimates suggest he had been exceptionally tall for his time. His hands were one of the most important clues. They did not look like the hands of a laborer. The nails were carefully kept. The fingers suggested someone who had not spent life doing heavy manual work. Isotope analysis also pointed to a high-status diet rich in meat and protein. This was not a poor man dragged from the edge of society. He was likely elite. Then came the injuries. Old Croghan Man had been stabbed. His arms had been pierced and bound. His body was mutilated. Most symbolically, his nipples had been cut. That detail sounds strange until it is placed into the world of early Irish kingship. In later Irish tradition, the nipple could be tied to royal submission and legitimacy. Removing them may have been a way to make a man permanently unfit for kingship, even in death. Clonycavan Man told a similar story from a different body. He was younger and smaller, but also showed signs of status. His hair was styled into a raised arrangement, using an ancient hair product made from plant oil and imported resin. That resin likely came from far beyond Ireland, showing access to trade goods and elite display. He too had eaten well, and he too had been violently killed. His skull had been crushed. His body showed mutilation. His nipples were also cut. These were not random injuries from a robbery or battlefield. They formed a pattern too specific to ignore. 2 elite men, killed in the Iron Age, placed in bogs near important territorial zones, both marked by violence that seemed ritual, political, and symbolic. That is where modern forensics transformed the case. The bog preserved tissue, hair, hands, stomach evidence, and chemical signatures. Radiocarbon dating placed the bodies in time. Isotope analysis reconstructed diet and status. Injury analysis separated accidental damage from deliberate killing. The bodies became files, and the files pointed toward a chilling conclusion. These men may have been failed kings, royal candidates, or elite figures sacrificed during political or environmental crisis. The bog itself matters. In Iron Age Europe, wetlands were not only empty wastelands, they could be boundary places, sacred places, thresholds between the human world and whatever lay beyond it. Weapons, valuables, and bodies were sometimes placed into bogs as offerings. A body left there may not have been hidden like a murder victim. It may have been handed over to the land. This is what makes Old Croghan Man and Clonycavan Man so disturbing. Their deaths were not simply violent. They were staged. The killing carried meaning. Their elite bodies were damaged in ways that attacked identity, status, and kingship itself. They were not only killed as men, they may have been unmade as rulers. Without modern forensics, much of that story would have remained invisible. A bog body can look like a horror from the past, but chemistry and pathology reveal the structure beneath the horror, what they ate, how they lived, where they stood in society, how they were bound, where the blows landed, and why the mutilation may have mattered. That is why old Croghan Man and Clonycavan Man belong among the ancient cold cases modern forensics finally solved. Their bodies turned a pair of gruesome bog discoveries into evidence for ritual politics in Iron Age Ireland. They were not anonymous victims of random violence. They were high-status men whose deaths may have been tied to sovereignty, sacrifice, and the terrifying idea that a failed ruler could be offered to the land. The bog kept their skin, the cuts kept their message, and after more than 2,000 years, modern science finally showed that these were not just bodies in peat. They were political murders written into flesh. Number 4. The Pazyryk Ice Maiden. The tattooed woman with ancient cancer in 1993, archaeologists working high on the Yukok Plateau in the Altai Mountains opened a burial mound that had become something more than a tomb. Water had entered the wooden chamber soon after burial, then frozen solid in the Siberian cold. For more than 2,000 years, the grave remained sealed inside ice. When the team reached the coffin, they were not simply uncovering bones. They were opening a natural freezer from the Iron Age. Inside was a young woman from the Pazyryk culture, a Scythian, related nomadic world of horse riders, animal art, felt, wood, tattoos, and frozen burials. She had been placed in a wooden coffin carved from a tree trunk. Around her were sacrificed horses, grave goods, a tall headdress, textiles, containers, and objects that marked her as someone of importance. Cold had preserved not only her body, but parts of the world that buried her. Her tattoos made her instantly famous. Across her shoulder and arm were dark animal designs, stylized creatures, antlered forms, mythical beasts, and flowing motifs that looked alive on skin more than 2,000 years old. These were not random decorations. They belonged to a visual language of identity, status, belief, and perhaps protection. To the modern world, she became the Ice Maiden, beautiful, mysterious, and frozen in time. But the most important evidence was not visible on the surface. Early examination noticed that something was wrong with her body, but the technology of the moment could not fully explain it. Years later, modern imaging reopened the case. CT and MRI scanning allowed researchers to look into the soft tissues and bones that the ice had preserved. What they found changed her story from an exotic burial into one of the oldest medical cold cases ever solved. She had cancer. The scans revealed signs consistent with advanced breast cancer. The disease had spread beyond the original tumor, reaching lymph nodes and bones. Lesions in her ribs and other skeletal areas suggested metastasis, meaning the cancer was no longer local. It had moved through her body. The Ice Maiden had not simply died as a remote nomadic princess in a beautiful frozen tomb. She had likely lived her final months or years in serious pain. That discovery stripped away the romantic distance around her. The tattoos, horses, headdress, and frozen grave showed status and ritual. The MRI showed suffering. A body that had looked almost ceremonial became deeply human. She was not only an archaeological treasure, she was a young woman with a disease modern people still fear, living in a world without surgery, chemotherapy, antibiotics, or modern pain control. Then the forensic evidence became even more intimate. Analysis of material from her burial suggested the presence of cannabis. In the context of her illness, researchers have suggested it may have been used for pain relief or ritual treatment during the final stage of disease. Whether medicine, ceremony, or both, the implication is powerful. The people around her may have known she was suffering, and they may have tried to ease it with the tools their world understood. This is what makes the Pazyryk Ice Maiden different from a simple mummy mystery. Her cold case was not about murder, it was about diagnosis. For centuries, ancient disease was invisible unless it damaged bone dramatically. Modern imaging changed that. Tumor, a metastasis, a fracture, a hidden lesion, a soft tissue abnormality, all of it can survive if the environment preserves enough of the body, and all of it can be read when the right machine arrives. Her case also shattered an old assumption that cancer is only a modern disease. Modern lifestyles may affect cancer rates, but cancer itself is ancient. It followed humans long before industrial cities, processed foods, or modern pollution. The Ice Maiden carried that truth in her bones. Her body proved that advanced cancer existed in the Iron Age steppe, inside a woman whose world was made of horses, mountains, tattoos, and burial ice. That is why the Pazyryk Ice Maiden belongs among the ancient cold cases modern forensics finally solved. She had been preserved so beautifully that people first saw her as an icon. Forensics revealed the patient beneath the icon. MRI turned mystery into diagnosis. Chemical traces turned burial goods into possible medicine. Her body became not only evidence of culture, but evidence of care, pain, and mortality. The ice kept her tattoos. It kept her skin. It kept her grave goods and the horses sacrificed beside her. But it also kept the disease that killed her, waiting until modern science could see it. More than 2,000 years after her burial, the Ice Maiden was finally given more than a face. She was given a cause, a suffering, and a final human truth. Even in the ancient world, behind status and ritual, the body could become its own cold case. Number 3. Beachy Head Lady. The Roman Britain skeleton that rewrote who belonged in the early 1950s. Near the white chalk cliffs of Beachy Head on the south coast of England, workers uncovered a human skeleton. It was not placed at the center of a famous royal tomb. It did not arrive wrapped in gold or sealed inside a pyramid. It was simply boxed, catalogued, and stored in a local museum collection, where it waited for decades with very little attention. For more than 60 years, the woman inside that box remained almost invisible. Then modern forensics reopened her case. She became known as the Beachy Head Lady, and at first glance, she seemed like an ordinary Roman-era burial from southern Britain. Radiocarbon dating placed her in the 3rd century CE, during the period when Britain was part of the Roman Empire. She had been buried simply, without evidence of violent injury. There was no dramatic stab wound, no smashed skull, no famous inscription naming her. Her cold case was not about how she died. It was about who she was and where she came from. That question changed everything. When researchers studied her skull, they found features suggesting ancestry that did not match the old image of Roman Britain as a mostly local, isolated, white European world at the edge of empire. Forensic facial reconstruction gave that evidence a face. A young woman with dark skin and African features, living and dying on the south coast of Britain more than 1,700 years ago. The image shocked many people not because it was impossible, but because it contradicted what popular history had taught them to expect. But the face was only the beginning. Isotope analysis made the case far stronger. A person's teeth preserve chemical signatures from childhood. Strontium isotopes reflect the geology of the place where someone grew up. Oxygen isotopes reflect climate and drinking water. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes help reveal diet. In the Beachy Head Lady's tooth enamel, the chemical signals did not point to the chalk landscapes of southern England. They pointed much farther away. Her childhood isotope profile suggested she had grown up in a warmer region, likely connected to sub-Saharan Africa or the broader tropical world. Her diet as a child included plants more typical of African agricultural systems, such as millet or sorghum, rather than the wheat, and barley diet common in Roman Britain. Then, later in life, her diet changed. She appears to have moved into a European food world, eating more like the people around her in Britain. Her body recorded migration, one childhood, one adulthood, two worlds written into the same skeleton. This is what makes the Beachy Head Lady such a powerful forensic cold case. She did not solve a murder, she solved an assumption. For a long time, popular imagination treated Roman Britain as geographically remote, culturally narrow, and far less diverse than the empire really was. But Rome was not a village system. It was a network of roads, ships, soldiers, merchants, servants, administrators, families, enslaved people, freed people, and travelers moving across Europe, Africa, and the Near East. The empire connected worlds, and people moved through those connections. The Beachy Head Lady proves that movement reached all the way to Britain. She may have arrived as part of a merchant household, military network, elite domestic group, trade route, or another social path that can no longer be reconstructed. There is no shackle evidence clearly marking her as enslaved. There is no inscription explaining her status. She was not reduced to one simple category. That is part of the power of the case. She was a person, not just a symbol. Modern forensics gave her back complexity. The skull suggested ancestry. The face reconstruction made her visible. The isotopes revealed childhood geography and dietary change. Together, they showed that Roman Britain was not the closed world many imagined. It included people whose lives crossed continents. A skeleton forgotten in a museum box became evidence against a simplified version of the past. That is why the Beachy head lady belongs among the ancient cold cases modern forensics finally solved. Her case shows that forensics does not only identify killers or causes of death, it can identify movement, identity, ancestry, and belonging. It can take a quiet skeleton with no famous grave and turn it into a witness against centuries of bad assumptions. For 60 years, she waited in storage. No one knew that her teeth carried a map, that her bones carried a challenge, that her face would force people to rethink who lived in Roman Britain. Then the right tools arrived, and the box became a biography. The Beachy head lady did not leave a written record, but her body still said something powerful. The ancient world was never as simple, isolated, or colorless as later history tried to make it. Number 2. Gebelein Man. The museum mummy, who was a murder victim for more than a century. Gebelein Man lay in the British Museum as one of the most famous naturally preserved bodies from ancient Egypt. Visitors knew him by a nickname Ginger because of the reddish hair still visible on his head after more than 5,000 years. He was not wrapped like the later royal mummies. He had not been embalmed by priests. The desert itself preserved him. Hot, dry sand pulled the moisture from his body so quickly that his skin, hair, fingernails, and shape survived into the modern world. For generations, that was the story. He was a remarkable predynastic mummy, a body from Egypt before the pharaohs, preserved by accident and time. Schoolchildren passed his display case. Tourists stared at his curled posture. Museum labels described his age, culture, and preservation. But nobody looking through the glass knew the most important fact about him. He had been murdered. Gebelein Man lived around 3,500 to 3,400 BCE in the late predynastic period of Egypt. This was centuries before the unification of Egypt, long before the pyramids, long before the golden age of pharaohs. He was a young man, probably in his late teens or early 20s. His body looked peaceful in the way ancient bodies often do when time removes context. But modern forensics does not trust appearances. It looks beneath the surface. In 2012, researchers placed him inside a CT scanner. The machine produced hundreds of internal images, slicing through the mummy digitally, without cutting into the body. For the first time, scientists could examine his skeleton organs, soft tissues, and injuries hidden beneath the preserved skin. What they found turned a museum mummy into a homicide case. Under his left shoulder blade was a wound. It was narrow, deep, and lethal. The blade had entered from behind, passing between the ribs and damaging vital tissue, likely piercing the lung. The injury was not obvious from the outside, which is why more than 100 years of display had missed it. But inside the body, the path of violence was still there. The angle of the wound suggested an attacker standing behind him, using a sharp weapon such as a copper or flint blade. There were no clear defensive wounds on his arms or hands. That detail matters. If he had seen the attack coming, he might have raised his hands, turned, blocked, grabbed, or fought. The absence of defense suggests surprise. Gebelein Man may have been struck before he understood he was in danger. That is what makes the case so chilling. He was not simply an ancient body. He was a young man killed from behind in prehistoric Egypt, centuries before the first pharaoh's name was written into history. The killer vanished completely. No trial record exists. No inscription names the conflict. No witness survived in story. But the wound survived, hidden beneath skin dried by desert sand. The CT scan also revealed details that made him feel less like an exhibit and more like a person. His last meal was preserved inside him, traces of food still in the stomach area, eaten only hours before death. He had not died after a long starvation. He had eaten, lived, moved through a normal day, and then violence interrupted him. The distance between routine and death may have been only a few hours. Later imaging revealed another astonishing detail. His skin carried tattoos, figurative tattoos of animals, including a wild bull and a Barbary sheep. These are among the earliest known figurative tattoos ever found on a human body. For more than a century, they had gone unnoticed, faint beneath the preserved skin. Infrared imaging brought them back into view, turning his body into evidence not only of murder, but of identity, symbolism, and self-presentation before dynastic Egypt. That is why Gebelein Man is one of the most powerful ancient cold cases modern forensics finally solved. He had been visible the whole time, yet unseen in the ways that mattered. His body was displayed as a miracle of preservation. But modern technology revealed a final act of violence, a last meal, hidden tattoos, and a life ended by a blade from behind. The museum had not been displaying only a mummy, it had been displaying a murder victim, and that changes how we look at him. The curled body behind glass is not just an archaeological specimen, it is a crime scene from before Egypt became Egypt. The wound under his shoulder blade is a message left by violence when writing could not yet record it. Gebelein Man did not leave a diary, a tomb inscription, or a spoken testimony. He left his body, and after more than 5,000 years, the CT scanner finally read what the desert had preserved. He had eaten. He had carried marks on his skin, and then someone came from behind with a blade. Number 1. Vitraup Man, the migrant sacrificed in a Danish bog in 1915. Peat cutters working in a wetland in northern Denmark struck human remains in the bog, a skull, a jaw, an ankle bone, and nearby, a wooden club. The pieces were ancient, damaged, and incomplete. But the meaning seemed simple enough at first. Someone had died violently, long before written history reached that part of Europe. The remains were placed into a museum collection, catalogued, preserved, and then left to wait. For more than a century, Vitraup Man was mostly a mystery. He lived between roughly 3300 and 3100 BCE, during one of the most important transitions in European prehistory. The old hunter-gatherer world was fading. Farming communities were expanding. New diets, rituals, settlements, and social boundaries were reshaping northern Europe. Vitraup Man died in the middle of that transformation, at a time when identity itself may have been changing from valley to valley. The skull showed extreme violence. He had been struck repeatedly in the head, not once in panic, but many times with deliberate force. The injuries matched the kind of damage a heavy wooden club could cause, and a club had been found near the remains. His death was not accidental. It was not a fall into the bog. Someone had attacked him hard enough to shatter the skull and end his life. For decades, that was nearly all anyone could say. A man, a bog, a club, a violent death. Then modern forensics reopened the case. Researchers studied isotopes preserved in his teeth and bones, tooth enamel forms in childhood, and locks in chemical signatures from the land where a person grew up. Strontium isotopes can point toward geology. Oxygen isotopes can reflect climate and drinking water. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes can reveal diet. In Vitraup Man, the signals did something extraordinary. They showed that he was not local. His childhood chemistry did not match Denmark. It pointed farther north toward the rocky landscapes of Norway or Sweden. His early diet was rich in marine food, the diet of a coastal hunter-gatherer world. But later in life, the chemistry changed. As an adult, he was eating the cereals and livestock foods of farming communities in Denmark. His body recorded a life split between two worlds. Ancient DNA sharpened the picture. Vitraup Man's ancestry was strongly hunter-gatherer, not the farmer ancestry spreading into Europe from the south. He was not simply a local farmer buried in a bog. He appears to have been born into a northern hunter-gatherer population, moved south, entered a farming community, changed his diet, lived there for years, and then died violently in a wetland. That is what makes the case so haunting. Vitraup Man was not just a victim, he was a migrant. He crossed cultural boundaries at a moment when Europe itself was being remade. He may have been adopted into a farming group, traded into it, married into it, captured by it, or joined it for reasons we can no longer know. His bones show integration. His death suggests something darker, the bog matters. Wetlands in prehistoric Europe were often more than empty places. They were thresholds between land and water, the living and the dead, the human world and the sacred. Bodies placed in bogs were not always hidden like ordinary murder victims. Some were offerings, some were executions, some were ritual deaths performed in places where the landscape itself was part of the act. Vitraup Man's repeated head blows and placement in the bog suggest his killing may have been ritualized. He may have been sacrificed, and if that is true, the forensic reconstruction becomes deeply unsettling. A hunter, gatherer man from the north moved into a farming world, lived with its people, ate their food, and was eventually killed by them as an offering. Modern science cannot tell us the motive. It cannot tell us whether he was feared, honored, punished, chosen, or betrayed. It cannot recover his name or the words spoken over the bog, but it can reveal the shape of the life before the death. The skull gave the violence. The isotopes gave the journey. The DNA gave the ancestry. Together, they turned scattered bones into a biography. That is why Vitraup Man belongs at number 1, among the ancient cold cases modern forensics finally solved. His case shows everything this video is about. A body forgotten in a museum, a violent death misunderstood for generations, and modern science returning with questions the past could not answer before. He was not just a skull in a bog. He was a traveler between worlds, killed at the edge of one of Europe's greatest transformations. For 5,300 years, the bog kept what history lost. It kept the broken skull, the chemistry of childhood, and the evidence of migration, diet, ancestry, and death. His given name is gone forever, but modern forensics gave him back something almost as powerful. A story. Vitraup Man died in silence. His teeth and bones finally spoke.